concentrate on inferior goods now. We'll start the approach with the same direction. So we have an initial budget line AB, which represents the initial pxx plus pyy equal to m situation, and the individual is at an initial equilibrium E, where the initial indifference curve, the highest possible indifference curve IC1, meets the initial budget line at point E. Consider a situation where there's a price fall, so there's an increased affordability of good X, which is marked on the x-axis, and the budget line shifts or pivots through point A to the new budget line AB1. The individual moves from point E to E1, where the E1 is the point of tangency between the new pivoted budget line, the switched budget line, which is tangent to the new highest possible indifference curve IC2. And we'll again make an income adjustment such that the individual is now at income level where he can achieve the initial utility that he achieved at the initial indifference curve IC1. So this adjusted budget line, which is essentially the budget line AB1 shifted downwards parallelly to CD, and we have the individual at an alternative or an intermediate equilibrium at E2. Now, the movement of the individual from point E to point E1 essentially illustrates the total price effect, where the fall in the price and the increased affordability did allow the individual to increase his consumption of good X from E to E1. This is the total price effect that happened in our scenario. But if we consider the substitution effect, which is the movement of the individual from the initial point to the intermediate point, that is from point E to E2, this movement was actually larger than the total price effect. So you see the substitution effect is from E to E2, whereas the price effect is just from E to E1. So the price effect is smaller than the substitution effect. How is that possible? So substitution effect can only move from left to right. There's no other alternative. But the income effect can move from right to left. So the income effect has essentially reversed its directions than it was in the normal good. In case of normal goods, income effect is from left to right. But in case of inferior goods, income effect is from right to left. So the direction of income effect essentially reverses in case of inferior goods. So you see the substitution effect was a length, and since the income effect nullifies part of the substitution effect, the price effect is essentially smaller than the substitution effect. So if the substitution effect moves, if I make an analogous transformation, if the substitution effect allows the individual to move a distance of 5 kilometers, the income effect allows the individual to move back a distance of, let's say, 1 kilometer. So the net distance that the individual has traversed, which is analogous to the price effect, is essentially 4 kilometers. So there's a there's a reducing effect of income effect on the total price effect. So in this case, the income effect is still negative, but here for inferior goods in general, the income effect is actually smaller, or it's weaker than the substitution effect. So it cannot completely nullify the substitution effect. So we have some amount of direct movement in the direction from left to right. So the individual to some extent increases his consumption due to the increased affordability of good X. But on the other hand, as we found out in the Giffen Good in our previous session, the income effect is so strong that it essentially pulls the individual back to a situation where the individual reduces the consumption of good X in spite of an increased affordability. So essentially, we can boil down our discussions into certain points. So in case of normal goods, we have certain points that we need to remember. So the substitution effect says if the relative price falls, then the quantity demanded rises. This substitution effect has the same statement for all goods, irrespective of whether they are normal goods or Giffen goods or inferior goods. So whenever the relative price of a good falls, quantity demanded of that good will always rise, irrespective of what kind of good they are. In case of normal goods, if the purchasing power rises, the quantity demanded will rise. This income effect is true only in case of normal goods. This is not true in case of Giffen goods or inferior goods. So when we add the substitution effect and income effect, the total price effect says that if price falls, the quantity demanded rises. And we of course have that standard equation which says the total price effect is the addition of the effect of substitution effect and income effect. Now let's find out the difference between normal goods and inferior goods. So you see, as I mentioned before, the substitution effect is the same for all goods. So as you can see, the statement for substitution effect is exactly identical in case of normal good and inferior good. So if the relative price falls, quantity demanded of that good will rise, no matter what happens. But if you see the income effect, as I said before, the purchasing power rising, quantity demanded rises only for normal goods. But you see, for inferior goods, if the purchasing power rises, the quantity demanded of that good falls, because it's an inferior good. If the purchasing power of the individual rises, he'll start buying better goods. He'll start shifting from inferior goods to normal goods. He'll buy better quality toys. He'll buy better quality clothes. He'll reduce the quantity demanded of the goods which are inferior in nature. The differentiating point between inferior good and Giffen good lies in the fact that in case of inferior goods in general, the income effect is smaller than substitution effect. So if the relative purchasing power rises, the quantity demanded does rise. The income effect causes that quantity demanded to fall by a certain amount, but it's not strong enough to reduce or to completely nullify the substitution effect. So let's say the substitution effect causes the quantity demanded to rise. It drops a little due to the income effect. When we add these two effects, the total price effect says if the price falls, the quantity demanded still rises. So when the substitution effect pulls the individual up a little, the income effect reduces that height a little, not the same distance, but the quantity of income effect is smaller. The effect of income effect is essentially smaller. The income effect is weaker and the substitution effect is stronger. So the TPE, or the total price effect, still says that if the price falls, quantity demanded rises. So this total price effect is kind of similar to the normal goods. So there may be situations where both for normal goods and for inferior goods, if the price falls, the quantity demanded rises. So inferior good is not essentially an exception to the law of demand. What is an exception to the law of demand is the Giffen good. So substitution effect, as again I said before, substitution effect is the same for all kinds of goods. So if relative price that is falls, the quantity demanded rises as for any other goods. And Giffen goods being a kind of inferior good, the income effect is the same. The direction of income effect is the same as inferior good for Giffen goods. So the income effect says if purchasing power rises, the quantity demanded falls. So it's the same in case of inferior good as in case of Giffen good. The difference between inferior good and Giffen good lies in the fact that in case of inferior good, the income effect was weaker than substitution effect, so it couldn't pull the individual back enough. But in case of Giffen good, the income effect is stronger than substitution effect. So the total substitution effect that caused the demand to rise, the income effect pulls it all down, and essentially the total price effect sees a fall in the quantity demanded. So the income effect essentially pulls down the individual. If the price, even though the price falls, the total price effect essentially sees a fall in the quantity demanded. This fact that there's a fall in the price of the good as well as the fall in the price and quantity demanded is the exception to the law of demand. So I've made a little diagrammatic representation. So you see, if I go back to the normal good, so let's say the substitution effect allows the individual to move from left to right by 2 arrows. The income effect is in the same direction. So the substitution effect and income effect work in the same direction. They are not contradicting each other. They work in the same direction. They work hand in hand for normal goods. Excuse me. So normal goods have all forces working in the same direction. So these two forces act in the same direction, the substitution effect and income effect, and they add up together to form the total price effect. So if the substitution effect allows the individual to move from left to right by 2 arrows, and if the income effect does the same, that is, the income effect again allows the individual to move from left to right in 2 arrows in the same direction, that the total price effect allows the individual to move by a total of 4 arrows. So there's a addition between the addition of substitution effect and income effect. On the other hand, if we see inferior goods, the substitution effect allows the individual to move forward, that is, move from left to right by 2 arrows, let's say, because we have considered the same situation. And as we know, substitution effect always allows the individual to move from left to right. The income effect works in a reverse direction than substitution effect. So the direction of income effect is essentially from right to left. It brings the individual back. However, you see, substitution effect is quantified by 2 arrows, but the income effect is quantified by 1 arrow. So the total price effect is still moving from left to right. Like the substitution effect moved by 2 arrows from left to right. The income effect brought the individual back by 1 arrow, but the net distance is still from left to right. The individual in total still moved from left to right. So there was still a quantity demand rise. So even if the price fell, even though the income effect is negative, even though the income effect causes the quantity demanded to fall owing to the purchasing power rise, the total price effect is still in a direction which says that the quantity demanded rises. So the income effect is not strong enough to nullify entirety of the substitution effect. In case of Giffen Goods, the income effect is stronger than substitution effect. So the substitution effect again moves from left to right in 2 arrows, but in case of Giffen Goods, the income effect is stronger than substitution effect. So the income effect pulls back the individual by 3 arrows. Substitution effect was by 2 arrows from left to right, but the income effect is 3 arrows from right to left. So what we are left with is the individual moves back from right to left by 1 arrow. So the entirety of the entire direction has been reversed. The income effect is in opposite direction and it's stronger than substitution effect, pulling back the individual such that the quantity demanded falls. So that is the prime difference between the Giffen Goods and normal goods. Now, income consumption curve, coming to income consumption curve, it shows how the consumer's purchasing power or consumer's purchases, rather, the purchasing pattern or the preference pattern varies with his income. This ICC can actually distinguish normal and inferior goods. So essentially, the income consumption curve checks the direction of the income effect. So it can differentiate between ICC, it can differentiate between normal goods and inferior goods. Now, Giffen Goods being a kind of inferior good, you can always track the movements of the Giffen Good through inferior good. But essentially, or to be very specific, the income consumption curve can distinguish between normal goods and inferior goods. So as you can see in this diagram, normal goods have been plotted on both axes, and the income consumption curve is positively sloped. So as the income of the individual increases, the individual keeps on increasing the consumption of both goods. On the other hand, we have 2 diagrams where on the top diagram, we have inferior good on the x-axis or the horizontal axis, and on the y-axis, we have normal good. And you see that the ICC is essentially backward bending. So after a certain point, the income consumption curve becomes negatively sloped. Similarly, if you check the other diagram, if we plot x-axis on the x-axis normal good and the y-axis inferior good, after a particular amount of income, the individual starts reducing the consumption of good y, which is the inferior good. Now, there are certain points that we need to remember. For normal goods, when both goods that are taken on both axes, when both of the goods are normal, ICC is positively sloped. When at least one of the goods is inferior, not necessarily Giffen, but just inferior, ICC has a negative slope. So even if it's Giffen or if it's not Giffen, as long as one of the goods are inferior, ICC will have a negative slope. Naturally, even in case of Giffen, ICC will have a negative slope. Both goods cannot simultaneously be considered inferior, because if I consider both goods to be inferior, that would imply that as my income increases, I reduce consumption altogether. So I reduce the consumption of both goods, which is absurd. It's kind of impossible in fact. So another thing is, as you can find out from the goods the diagrams which involve inferior good, the ICCs are always backward bending. So it implies the basic fact that what is inferior today must have been normal in the past, which is why the portion of the ICCs, the portion of the backward ICCs which are positively sloped, for that period of time, both good X and Y were normal. So at that point, ICC was positively sloped. As soon as good X becomes, or good Y essentially becomes inferior, the ICC bends backward. So what is inferior today must have been normal in the past. Hence, we have backward bending ICCs.